The 8th second fall into darkness, dark screen, slow heartbeat, distant scraping, narrator cold low. The photograph you are about to see was declared impossible the moment it was found. As the frame brightens, a single picture slides forward. 2 small boys seated stiffly in funeral chairs. Eyes open, dirt still crusted in the creases of their shirts, their fingernails pitch black, taken in 1858, 2 days after they were buried. A whisper of wind sweeps through grass, though there is no grass in the frame, just a stretched, unnatural stillness around the boys' faces. This is where historians look away, because the story of Elias and Matthias Prescott is not about death. It is about interruption, the moment a family, a church, and an entire Massachusetts township attempted to bury a mistake that would not stay underground. Tonight we reopen the ground they sealed, because the boys were photographed post-mortem. That part was normal. But the coroner's testimony, the soil samples on their clothes, the bruising on their lips, the position of their hands, everything suggested one truth the church elders stamped out immediately. The Prescott brothers were alive when they went into the ground, and someone forced the photographer to document it. Tonight, we trace that truth backward, to the orphanage that trained children to be silent, to the minister who preached obedience above breath, to a town that punished those who spoke when they were not spoken to asylum records erased with fresh ink, to graves that were dug too quickly and watched too closely. This is the forgotten history they tried to collapse, like lungs under dirt. Welcome to the excavation. The town that didn't want children, Prescott Hollow, Massachusetts, wasn't built for families. Its earliest maps show no schoolhouse, no playgrounds, no gathering greens, just a church so large its shadow blanketed the town's only road. Travelers wrote that Prescott Hollow felt unfinished, as if the builders stopped once the church was complete. But the absence of children wasn't coincidence. The Hollow rejected them. From its founding in 1811, birth records were unusually low. Any families barred from having children by spiritual decree. Women whispered of miscarriages that happened in clusters, always after meetings with the clergy. Newcomers with children often left within months, returning with hollow faces and no explanation. Some never returned at all. This was not a place where young life thrived. So when the Prescott brothers arrived, orphans delivered by carriage with falsified papers, locals claimed it was the first time they'd seen children in town in more than a decade. Yet the minister, Reverend Alden Trammell, welcomed them with unnatural eagerness. He declared that innocent vessels must be shaped early while they still bend, hinting that the boys would serve a purpose greater than themselves. He took personal responsibility for their upbringing. He took personal responsibility for their discipline, and he took personal responsibility for their silence. The townspeople didn't intervene. In Prescott Hollow, the church was beyond question. The Reverend's word was law, legal, spiritual, and social. The boys rarely left the rectory. When they did, neighbors noticed they never spoke. Their faces seemed flattened by obedience, as if every expression had been trained out of them. Everyone assumed they were mute. Everyone assumed it was natural. No one realized until it was too late that the boys had been trained to act like the dead long before they were placed in the ground. In the orphanage that erased noise, the Prescott brothers came from St. Florentine's Home for Wayward Youth, a notoriously severe Boston orphanage, closed in 1866 after a string of childhood fatalities. At the time of the boys' placement, the orphanage was run by a woman known only as Matron Eddyvane, a figure whispered about but seldom seen. Surviving records describe her doctrine as the removal of disruptive qualities. What she meant was sound. Children were drilled to walk without footsteps, eat without clatter, breathe without tremor, speaking out of turn, was punished with days of isolation inside the iron-latched reflection chambers. Rumors say these chambers were lined with burlap to swallow voices, ensuring no sound escaped. Her motto, stitched into a banner over the dining hall, "Noise is the gateway to sin." The Prescott brothers, already timid and rail-thin, were perfect subjects. Etta Vane noted they showed high compliance. She wrote that their silence was near holy. But her final entry about them was different. The brothers have begun whispering to each other at night. I cannot locate the source of what they repeat. The words are not English. They do not sound like anything I know. 2 weeks later, she arranged for their immediate transfer to Prescott Hollow. The Reverend signed the acceptance papers within hours. A photograph taken at the orphanage a day before their departure shows the boys standing unnaturally straight, eyes wide, lips pressed into bloodless lines. A shadow of someone behind them. A hand on each shoulder was scratched out later in ink, so thick it nearly tore the photograph. Etta Vane never explained why she sent them away so suddenly, but the surviving children of St. Florentines remembered one thing: the brothers' whispers weren't quiet. They were wrong. Reverend Trammell and the doctrine of burial in 1858. Reverend Alden Trammell was the spiritual and civic ruler of Prescott Hollow. His sermons were described as correctional, more judicial than holy. He demanded obedience, purity, and above all, submission of the body to divine will. One doctrine defined his rule: burial of the living, not literal burial, at least not publicly. The phrase referred to a ritual of forced stillness, in which children were trained to lie perfectly motionless for hours, eyes open, breath minimal, to symbolize their death to earthly desires. Those who failed were beaten, those who cried were isolated, those who resisted were disappeared. The brothers excelled. Witnesses recalled seeing them lying in the churchyard grass for entire afternoons, unmoving despite ants crawling across their skin. Reverend Trammell praised them, calling them examples of divine surrender, but something else was happening behind closed doors. Mrs. Cora Underleaf, the church cleaner, testified decades later that the Reverend forced the boys into wooden boxes, coffins without lids, and ordered them to practice yielding. He timed how long they could remain still. Then he timed how long they could remain silent. Then, this part of her testimony was sealed. He reportedly timed how long they could go without air. Other children from the region brought for spiritual refinement often returned pale, trembling, refusing to speak at all. Some were so traumatized they were institutionalized within a year. But the Prescott brothers were different. They endured, they adapted, they obeyed every command until obedience became indistinguishable from death. And in Trammell's eyes, that made them perfect for what came next. The final lesson: stillness under earth. Witness accounts from early 1858 describe a shift in the Reverend's behavior. He became distracted, feverish, muttering about voices in the soil and promises beneath the root line. He preached that the ground remembers the obedient. Then came the ritual. Each child was required to pass one last test of surrender, lying beneath a thin layer of loose soil inside the rectory cellar. A symbolic burial. Most children panicked, screaming to be released. The Reverend claimed their fear revealed spiritual contamination, but the Prescott brothers stayed calm. One child survivor remembered watching Elias and Matthias lowered into the shallow pit. Instead of crying, they clasped hands, closed their eyes, and breathed slowly, almost rhythmically. They remained perfectly still. After 15 minutes, the Reverend lifted them out, elated, but the boys were strangely drowsy, swaying as if something had pulled them downward inside themselves. Later, other children reported hearing the brothers whisper in their sleep, It was speaking to us below. Their voices blended, overlapping in a way children's voices shouldn't. The words were jagged, glottal, layered in tones no human throat should produce. The Reverend's journals confirm these observations. His handwriting spirals, they heard it. The soil accepted them, the earth spoke back. From that day forward, he took the brothers to the cellar daily. The sessions grew longer, the soil grew deeper, their whispers intensified, until one night the household staff heard a third voice responding, low, shifting, like wind pulled through stone. Trammell believed the boys were conduits, but if he thought he controlled whatever answered them, he misunderstood the nature of the ground beneath Prescott Hollow. The night the brothers stopped speaking, according to the surviving fragment of the rectory logbook, March 2nd, 1858, was the last night anyone heard the brothers speak. The entry simply read, "Midnight trial complete. They are ready." The household staff heard a commotion from the cellar, scraping, muffled cries, then complete silence. When the Reverend emerged, he was covered in dust, his expression wild with triumph. He claimed the boys had achieved perfect surrender. But Cora Underleaf swore she saw something else. The boys shuffling behind him, faces blank, eyes unfocused, movements puppet-like. They didn't look traumatized, they looked absent. The Reverend ordered them to bed despite the late hour. When Cora checked on them at dawn, Elias and Matthias were sitting upright in bed, hands folded, facing the window though the shutters were closed. Their eyes didn't blink, their chests barely moved. When she whispered their names, they didn't respond. But both boys slowly turned their heads toward her in unison, without shifting their shoulders. That detail haunted her for the rest of her life. Later that morning, the Reverend gathered the town elders, announcing the brothers were undergoing spiritual transformation. He forbade anyone from entering the rectory. Rumors spread that the boys were ill, possessed, or in some kind of trance, but the truth was simpler and far more horrifying. Elias and Matthias Prescott had been left too long under the soil the night before. They had suffocated. They had died, but they had come back up walking. Something came back with them, and as the Reverend would soon realize, whatever returned wearing their bodies wasn't finished demanding obedience. At the unauthorized burial 2 days after the midnight ritual, the brothers collapsed during morning prayer. Their bodies were rigid, cold, with no detectable breath. Reverend Trammell declared them deceased from natural spiritual exhaustion, forbidding medical examination. At sunset, he ordered an immediate burial without notifying the township, without a death certificate, without a coffin maker present. Only the church elders assisted. Eyewitnesses described the burial as rushed, frantic. The graves were dug shallow, barely a foot of soil covering the boys. One elder later confessed that the Reverend kept looking over his shoulder, muttering that it was watching. No prayers were spoken. No hymns were sung, no families mourned. By dawn, the boys were in the earth, but several elders reported hearing faint thumps during the burial. When they paused, the sound stopped. When they resumed, it started again, rhythmic, desperate. None dared to speak of it. Cora Underleaf, hiding behind a headstone, saw the soil shift after the final shovelful was placed. She insisted the brothers were still alive. The Reverend refused to listen. He ordered everyone to forget the burial had occurred. But the ground did not forget. That night, the church bell rang 3 times despite no one being inside the tower, and a low moan rolled through the graveyard. At dawn, the Reverend gathered his elders again. The graves were open. The soil was scattered. The pits were empty. The boys were gone. Footprints, small, bare, and caked in mud, led toward the town. And at the end of those prints lay something far worse. 2 sets of fingernail gouges on the rectory door, dragged downward, as if the boys were trying to hold themselves upright. At the return to the rectory hours after discovering the empty graves, Reverend Trammell barred the rectory doors and sent the elders home. He locked himself inside with a lantern and his Bible, trembling. He wrote in his journal, "They are not as they were. The ground remade them." Throughout the night, neighbors reported hearing scraping along the walls, slow dragging footsteps circling the house, and faint tapping against the windows, always in pairs. At midnight, the tapping stopped. The rectory went dead silent. Then, according to Cora Underleaf, who lived across the road, two small silhouettes appeared at the front steps. They stood perfectly still for nearly an hour. When the door finally opened, the Reverend's lantern light illuminated their faces. Their skin had a grayish cast. Soil clung to their ears, nostrils, and eyelashes. Their clothes were stiff with dirt. But what terrified Cora was their breathing. It came in short, sharp bursts, like something unfamiliar with lungs. The Reverend ushered them inside, trembling as he locked the door behind them. Journal entries recovered years later describe the horrifying hours that followed. The Reverend claimed the boys did not walk, they arrived. He wrote, "They look at me as one looks at a failed servant." He attempted to pray over them, but the boys began whispering again, those same guttural syllables they had spoken in the cellar. Except now, their voices echoed as if spoken from deep within the earth. The lantern flickered. Something moved behind the boys, something the Reverend refused to describe directly. His handwriting breaks into scratches and ink, blots. He finally wrote one clear line, "It wants me to finish the burial." At the photographer's summoning at dawn on March 6th, Reverend Trammell staggered out of the rectory, pale and shaking. He went straight to the home of Josiah Felton, the town's photographer. Felton later said the Reverend looked hollowed out, his hands trembling violently even when still. Trammell ordered him to bring his daguerreotype equipment immediately. Felton protested no one took photographs of the dead without family consent. The Reverend grabbed him by the collar. "They are not dead," he hissed. "They must be witnessed, documented, proven." Felton reluctantly followed him to the rectory. When he stepped inside, the air felt unnaturally cold. The shutters were closed. The floorboards smelled of damp soil. The boys sat upright in funeral chairs, dressed in clean clothes that did nothing to disguise the dirt beneath their nails or the purplish discoloration along their throats. Felton asked if he should adjust their posture. "Do not touch them," the Reverend warned. Felton approached Elias first. The boy's eyes were open, far wider than natural, irises dull like wet ash. His chest rose shallowly, irregularly, as if breath was an afterthought. When Felton removed the lens cap, Matthias suddenly turned to look at him. The movement was abrupt, too precise, too controlled. The boy's lips parted. A low hum pushed out, vibrating, layered, wrong. Felton nearly dropped the plate. The Reverend forced him to continue. The photograph was taken in total silence. Felton later testified that as he packed up his equipment, he felt something shifting beneath the floorboards, like soil settling. The Reverend escorted him out and locked the door. Felton fled the house without looking back. He told the elders the boys were alive. The elders told him to forget what he saw, but the photograph did not forget. The photograph that should not exist when Felton developed the daguerreotype that evening. He expected to see two still, expressionless boys seated formally. What emerged instead tore through the town like a sickness. In the image, the boys' pupils reflected not light, but depth. Cavernous, bottomless, like staring down into a pit. Their skin bore faint cracks along the jaw and temples, as if dried mud hid beneath the surface. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the boys. It was the shadows. Behind each child, barely perceptible unless examined closely, stood a darker outline, long, limbed, stooped, featureless. Its edges appeared smeared, as though the camera attempted to erase it. The figures leaned forward, hands hovering just above the boy's shoulders. Felton tried to dispose of the photograph, but the Reverend burst into his studio demanding it. He seized the plate with shaking hands. The ground marked them, he whispered, it has chosen them. He locked the photograph in the rectory's upper drawer. Hours later, neighbors heard screaming. When they reached the rectory, the door was barred. The house was dark except for a flickering light in the upstairs window. Something thrashed inside, heavy, frantic, inhuman, and then silence. The Reverend stopped leaving the rectory after that night. People glimpsed him through the window, pacing, sweating, clenching his Bible so hard the leather tore. He kept the shutters closed, but late at night, faint childish whispers seeped through the cracks. The photograph, even today, appears impossible. Experts claim hands that size could not belong to children, but the worst detail is the dirt on the boys' collars. Because in the imaging, the soil looks fresh, still damp, still alive. The Reverend's breakdown in the days after the photograph was taken. Reverend Trammell unraveled. He stopped preaching, he stopped eating, he stopped sleeping. Cora Underleaf claimed she heard him muttering through the walls. They want me to finish it, they want me underground. The living must obey. At night, the townspeople reported seeing small shapes moving behind the rectory curtains, shapes too slight to be adult, too steady to be children. On March 8th, the Reverend's journal entries shifted from frightened to frantic. The surviving pages, now brittle and stained, read, "They do not tire, they do not blink, they do not stop. Their breath rattles like stones. They watch me as if measuring me for something." One entry simply reads, "They brought soil into my room. I did not hear them move." Cora brought him food on the morning of the 9th. When she knocked, the door creaked open on its own. The inside of the rectory was dark, cold, sour, with the smell of wet earth. The Reverend sat on the floor, his clothes stained with dirt, fingernails cracked, Bible ripped apart beside him. He whispered, "They're waiting for night." When Cora asked who, he pointed upward, not to heaven, to the attic, where faint scratching echoed through the beams, scratching too controlled to be rodents, too rhythmic to be random. The Reverend begged Cora to flee Prescott Hollow. She refused. He grabbed her wrist, eyes bulging. "The ground remembers, Cora, and it wants to be repaid." That evening, the boys descended from the attic, and nothing in Prescott Hollow would remain the same. The night of the empty town on March 10th, at precisely 11:47 p.m., every dog in Prescott Hollow began barking. 10 seconds later, every candle and lantern in the town extinguished simultaneously. Survivors recalled the air changing, growing dense, metallic, heavy with the scent of turned soil. People fled to their windows, peering out into a darkness so absolute it felt pressed against the glass. Then the church bell began to toll, slow, uneven, dragged, but no one was inside the tower. Children started crying in their beds. Adults swore they heard soft footsteps on their roofs, pairs of feet, dragging slightly, moving deliberately. The sound traveled from house to house. Then came the whispers. They drifted through the streets in overlapping layers, all in the same unnatural cadence, like the Prescott brothers' voices multiplied. One phrase repeated, "Back to the ground, back to the ground." Panic seized the town. Families tried to flee to the woods, but the moment they stepped beyond the last house, the darkness thickened so heavy it blurred vision. Several people collapsed unconscious at the tree line, later found with soil packed beneath their fingernails. Meanwhile, at the rectory, the Reverend faced the brothers. Neighbors heard his screams. A single lantern glow flickered through the window. Shadows stretched unnaturally long along the walls, twitching, multiplying. Then a sudden crack, a crash, a violent thud, and silence. At dawn, the town reawakened. Every dog was dead. Every window faced the church. Every house had a thin trail of soil leading to its doorstep. And at the rectory door lay a single object, the post-mortem photograph. Now cracked corner to corner, the discovery of the Reverend when the townspeople finally entered the rectory, they found Reverend Trammell collapsed near the cellar door. His face was pale, lips blue, his breath shallow but present. He was gripping a scrap of paper so tightly that the ink transferred to his skin. When they pried it from his hand, it contained only 4 words. They were never alone. The rectory interior looked as though a storm had raged through it. Soil covered the floors in streaks and handprints. The chairs were overturned. Pages from the Reverend's Bible littered the hallway like shed feathers. But the most disturbing sight was the cellar. The door was open. Fresh claw marks lined the inside, small, child-sized. The soil pit at the center had been expanded, dug deeper than any child could manage in one night. The air was frigid. One elder leaned over the pit and immediately screamed. 2 perfect impressions of bodies lay in the dirt, not lying down, standing upright, as if they had sunk into the earth vertically. The impressions were unnaturally deep. They reached more than 5 feet down. The elders dragged the Reverend upstairs, but he began convulsing, gasping for breath. Between spasms, he choked out, "I didn't bury them deep enough." He was taken to the church infirmary, where he continued to ramble about voices below the joists, and the hands that lifted them back up. When asked where the boys were, he shook violently. "Behind your eyes," he whispered, "waiting for you to blink." He died minutes later, his lungs filled with soil. The official record attributed it to respiratory failure. But the townspeople who washed his body said dirt poured from his mouth long after he stopped breathing. The town's cover-up, the elders gathered in emergency council. Panic rippled through Prescott Hollow. Families preparing wagons, whispering of curses, hauntings, and the Reverend's madness. But the elders chose a different solution. Erase everything. They sealed the rectory. They burned the Reverend's journals. They confiscated the photograph, though not all copies. They declared the boys lost to illness and ordered immediate reburial, despite no bodies being present. When Felton protested, insisting the photograph proved the boys had been alive, the elders threatened him with charges of spiritual misconduct. He fled town the next morning. Cora Underleaf was silenced. Officially, she died of winter fever. Unofficially, her body was discovered with soil packed into her ears and nose. The Hollow became paranoid, suspicious of every rustle of leaves, every creak of the floorboards. Children were forbidden from going outside after dusk. But the elders' greatest mistake was attempting to fill the cellar pit. Every morning, the soil they shoveled in was found displaced again, scattered across the floor, as though something had climbed out. The deeper they dug, the more they unearthed tiny bones, scraps of children's clothing, rusted nameplates from past orphans, all buried far deeper than the pit had ever been dug. The town realized the Reverend hadn't invented the ritual. He had inherited it. Some families fled. Others stayed out of fear, believing leaving would invite something to follow. Over time, Prescott Hollow dissolved. By 1874, fewer than 30 residents remained, but the photograph survived. Smuggled through generations, hidden in attics, feared, then forgotten, yet the soil under the rectory remained unsettled. And at night, people claimed they could hear tapping beneath the floorboards, always in pairs. The photograph's second appearance in 1903, nearly half a century after the Prescott tragedy, construction workers renovating the abandoned rectory discovered a locked drawer in the upstairs study. Inside lay the daguerreotype plate Felton had taken, perfectly preserved. The workers were horrified to find the image exactly as described in the old town records: 2 boys with dirt-crusted faces, dead eyes staring outward, and those faint, impossible shadows behind them. But there was a new detail no one expected. The boys' heads were slightly tilted differently than in Felton's original, as if they had moved. One worker, A man named Hale claimed he saw the shadows flicker in the reflection of his lantern, stretching toward him. The crew abandoned the renovation. The rectory was boarded up again, but Hale kept the photograph. Within weeks, his behavior changed. His wife said he refused to go into their basement, insisting he heard whispering through the floorboards. He began waking at night with soil on his hands, dirt under his fingernails, mud on his sheets. He insisted he wasn't sleepwalking. He insisted something was climbing up from beneath their home. When Hale vanished later that year, his house was found in disarray. Every door was open. The basement floor was covered in fresh soil. The photograph lay in the center of the cellar. Face down, when the police lifted it, they found 2 small, muddy footprints beneath it, too small to belong to Hale, exactly the size of the Prescott brothers. The photograph was confiscated as evidence and disappeared into state archives. Hale's body was never found, though neighbors swore they still heard footsteps in his basement long after the house was abandoned. Steady, dragging, always 2 at a time, the historian who tried to prove it false in 1928, academic historian Dr. Lucinda Ward, began researching forgotten New England folklore when she found references to the Prescott brothers. She dismissed the story as superstition, an exaggerated tale of religious fanaticism. Then she found the photograph. Stored in a mislabeled archival envelope, it was wrapped in muslin and sealed with wax. The archivist refused to open it. Dr. Ward broke the seal herself. The moment she saw the boys' faces, she froze. She later wrote, "Their eyes followed me, not in superstition visually, physically. I shifted position, and their gaze adjusted." She assumed it was her imagination, until she noticed something impossible. Particles of dried soil flecked the inside of the muslin wrap. She ordered a soil analysis. The results came back showing the dirt was fresh, less than a month old. But the photograph had been sealed for decades. Dr. Ward dove deeper, visiting Prescott Hollow. She found the town nearly empty. Only 6 families remained. The rectory, though collapsed, still emitted a faint smell of damp earth. Locals refused to discuss the brothers. One elderly woman whispered, "You don't dig up what the ground wants." Dr. Ward returned to her boarding house shaken, convinced she had stumbled onto something more than folklore. She prepared a full report, but she never finished it. 2 days later, the boarding housekeeper found her room ransacked, soil scattered across the floorboards, and her research torn into strips. The photograph was gone, the only clue left behind. 2 small footprints on Dr. Ward's pillow, pressed into the fabric, perfectly parallel, as if someone or something had stood there watching her sleep. In the final exhumation in 1946, a rural land survey brought officials back to the ruins of Prescott Hollow. They demolished the remnants of the church and rectory to prepare for redevelopment. When workers began clearing the basement, they discovered the ground beneath the floor had caved in, revealing a deep, narrow shaft descending into darkness. At the bottom lay dozens of small skeletons, child-sized, arranged vertically, as if buried standing up. Arms pinned to their sides, skulls tilted upward, mouths open. Some appeared to have clawed upward before dying. But 2 impressions at the very bottom were different, not skeletons, just faint outlines, like the space where bodies had once stood, now long vacated. The soil at the base was damp, fresh. Workers fled the pit immediately. A state investigation followed, declaring it a historical mass grave. But the real horror emerged when soil samples were analyzed. The lowest layer contained human fingernail fragments, massive quantities, all belonging to children. But one detail stood out. 2 sets of fragments were significantly newer than the rest, decades newer. The same age as the Prescott brothers. That night, the surveyors camped near the site, around 2 a.m. 2 men awoke to soft footsteps circling their tents. Slow, dragging, synchronized. When they called out, the footsteps stopped, but the soil outside their tents shifted. 2 small depressions forming in the dirt, side by side. Exactly the size of children's feet. The men fled the site and refused to return. The redevelopment project was abandoned, and the shaft was filled in with concrete, but those who sealed it said they heard a faint knocking from beneath the ground as the cement poured. Knocks that came in pairs. The photograph today, the last confirmed sighting of the Prescott photograph, occurred in 1954 when an anonymous donor mailed it to a Boston museum. Package included no return address, only a note, "Do not open until the ground stops moving." Curators, assuming it was a prank, opened the parcel. Inside was the muslin, wrapped daguerreotype. The moment they touched the cloth, soil spilled out onto the floor. But the muslin was perfectly dry. The photograph itself was unchanged. 2 boys sitting stiffly, eyes wide, shadows looming behind them. Except now, the boys' mouths were slightly open, and their hands were no longer folded. They rested on the armrests of the chairs, as if pushing themselves upward. The museum sealed the photograph in a lead-lined archival case, but overnight the case cracked from the inside. Soil seeped out, fresh, wet, cold, terrified. The museum board ordered the artifact transferred to a private collection. Its location today is unknown, but rumors persist. Archivists whisper that in certain New England towns, people have woken to find soil beside their beds, small footprints in their hallways, and faint whispers in the walls at night, back to the ground. Several recent photographs from antique shops show 2 small figures lurking in the background, blurred, gray-faced, watching. Always 2, always in pairs. Few believe these sightings. Fewer are willing to investigate, because those who do disappear, leaving only dirt, scattered footprints, and the faint scent of damp earth behind. And somewhere out there, the Prescott brothers continue their walk. Still children, still dead, still moving, waiting for someone else to join them underground. The return to Prescott Hollow today. Prescott Hollow is a ghost town. Only 3 structures remain standing: the church foundation, the rectory's concrete slab, and a lone stone marker bearing no name. Visitors report an oppressive silence, a silence so complete it feels intentional. The ground is soft, even in drought. Footprints linger longer than they should, and the air carries a faint tremor, like something shifting far below the surface. Modern paranormal teams have tried to investigate. Most leave early. One crew's audio equipment captured whispers beneath the static, 2 voices, layered over each other, speaking in that same guttural rhythm described in the Reverend's journals. Another captured the sound of dirt falling in the background, though no one was moving and the ground was dry. But the most disturbing evidence came from a thermal camera. It recorded 2 heat signatures standing beside the old rectory foundation. Child-sized, motionless, unblinking, the signatures disappeared the moment the camera operator blinked. Local folklore now calls Prescott Hollow the town that reburies itself. People claim the ground shifts at night, forming shallow depressions that vanish by morning. Some depressions look like footprints, some look like graves, and some resemble small bodies pressing upward from beneath, trying to climb back out. Travelers who camp near, by report, awakening to find soil on their blankets, or small handprints on their car windows. Always 2, side by side, as if watching, waiting. Those who linger too long report dreams of suffocation, lungs filling with dirt, the pressure of soil on their chest, whispers echoing in the darkness. When they wake, their fingernails hurt, as if they've been clawing at something, and when they brush their hands together, soil falls out. At the closing warning, narrator low, steady, "You've heard the account, you've seen the evidence, now you must understand the truth. Some tragedies do not fade, some deaths do not rest, and some children never stop climbing. The Prescott brothers were not victims of ritual. They were not victims of madness. They were not victims of obedience. They were claimed by the ground beneath Prescott Hollow, soil soaked with centuries of forgotten burials, orphaned children, and punishments disguised as faith. The Reverend thought he could command it, control it, offer the boys as vessels, but the ground had always been hungry. It took them, it remade them, and then it sent them back up, walking, watching, calling others downward. Look at your floor, your walls, your foundation. Listen closely. Do you hear a faint tapping, a dragging step? A whisper that sounds like two voices speaking at once. The ground beneath you is never silent. And if you ever wake to find dirt on your sheets, or footprints beside your bed, or the sensation of someone standing inches from your face, do not open your eyes. Do not move, do not breathe, do not speak, because once the Prescott brothers find you, they will wait for the moment you blink. Then they will take you by the wrists gently, carefully, and pull you back down to where they learned their final lesson. Back to the ground, back to the earth that remembers, back to the dark that does not forgive. Narrator, this was the story of the Prescott brothers, a post-mortem photograph of children buried alive, fade to black. Wind, scraping, a final whisper, come with us.